evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the 5th episode of our weekly podcast, Just Politics, Our World View, where we discuss politics in Barbados, the region, and the rest of the world. Remember that you can find us here every Sunday from 5 to 7 p.m. But please indulge me just a moment to shout out Sasha Lee, who is one of our viewers, who graciously volunteered her time to start our Instagram page and to make our presence here better. And she's a professional in this area, so she reached out to us, and of course, we are eternally grateful. So if you noticed us this week looking all professional as though we knew what we were doing, this was all due to her intervention. So thank you so much, Sasha. So if anyone else has any ideas or a particular skill set and you want to help us out, feel free to reach out. Feel free to volunteer. This is your show. We do this for you, and we are completely open and accommodating. Good evening once again. I am your host, Ayo Olalara, and this is my co-host, Dr. Terry Harris. Over to you, Terry.
Thanks, Ayo. Good evening, everyone. Welcome back. And so this week we have as a guest, Dr. Kristina Hinds, who's a political scientist and senior lecturer in politics and international relations at the University of the West Indies Cape Hill campus. Dr. Hinds is also an author and has published a recent book entitled Civil Society, Governance, and the Caribbean Community. She is an activist and a host of the popular radio show, Down to Brass Stats on VOB 92.9. Welcome, Dr. Hinds.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
So we're happy to have her here for our 5th show, which is entitled, or the topic is Women in Politics. And so we're going to spend some time discussing that topic and her new book, Civil Society, Governance, and the Caribbean Community. This week's episode is brought to you by Desiree Properties, Inc. for construction, interior and building design, interior decorating, and so much more. You can reach them at 624-0593. And now on to the next segment, the weekly roundup with Ayo. So Ayo, take it away.
Thank you again, Terry, and welcome back again, everyone, and welcome to the weekly roundup. In Barbados, the St. George North by-election has ended, and as predicted by every political pundit worth their credentials, Tony Moore has won. But Floy Reefer has proven once again that the Democratic Labour Party still has some work to do if it is to compete in a mere motley's world. According to him, however, he's still batting. Also, Granville Phillips has bowed out of politics, deciding that he's just an engineer.
Really? You sure?
And the scariest thing about the by-election is that Alex Mitchell amassed a grand total of 10 votes. Think about it. There were 10 people who watched him during the debates, read his social media rants, and thought, yes, he'll make a great leader.
Barbados is full of mad people. Well,
Strange people. In the United States of America, Trump is still refusing to concede defeats at the poll. This is simultaneously embarrassing and satisfying to watch. For decades, the United States of America has stepped on the constitutional rights of other countries, raided them for oil, and pretty much degraded and killed progressive world leaders in the name of democracy. And now this same country elected a madman to its highest office, and he seems intent on destroying its very fabric from the inside out. What a show. And I can't help but watch. So now the Trump administration is blocking the transition process for the president and vice president-elect, refusing to give them security briefings, refusing to give them access to the transition fund, and even refusing to give them access to messages of congratulations from other world leaders. So right now, Auntie Mia's message is sitting somewhere at the bottom of the pile under Vladimir Putin's.
Hello.
And drum roll, please. For centuries, the statue of a supporter of the ignoble slavery system has overlooked one of the most prominent sites in Barbados, where some 97% of the descendants of the formerly enslaved reside. On Monday, which is tomorrow, after decades of protests through marches, petitions, letters to the editor, panel discussions, and even defacing, it comes to an end. Lord Nelson's statue in Bridgetown, Barbados will be removed. And whilst it won't find its rightful home at the bottom of Carlisle Bay, it will no longer help to reinforce the Stockholm Syndrome, which so many of us continue to suffer. I express congratulations to everyone through the years who shone a light on why it was such a tragic travesty for this statue to occupy this position of honor in the first place, and to the government of Barbados for having the gumption to right this wrong. You can all give yourselves a pat on the back. And as you know, the internet keeps giving, so here are some of the best political memes of the week. And my good friend Cassandra made this one. She thought she'd let Granville know that he can still visit Nelson anytime he chooses. This one isn't quite a meme. It's the actual results of the margins of the popular vote by elections from 2000 to 2020. And if you look at Trump's, I mean, it's apparent, but he still continues to refuse to accept the outcome of the election. It'd be funnier if it wasn't such a shame.
What are you talking about, Ayo? He's the greatest. He's the best. He's the greatest. The best.
Yes, he lost bigly. He's the best at losing.
Bigly.
Bigly. And Arizona, if you know, is a traditionally red state, but after Trump criticized one of its heroes, John McCain, who was a prisoner of war, by stating that he doesn't consider him a hero, since he likes heroes who don't get caught. Well, Arizona had its revenge, and the state turned blue this election for the first time since 1996. And of course, the internet had a lot of fun with its John McCain memes. But the next one is also pretty golden, I think. Psychiatrists all over probably agree that there's one main reason Trump is unwilling to admit defeat: his father. We can all trace some features of our behavior back to our childhood, right?
I know I can.
There you go. And on that note, here ends the weekly roundup. Viewers, please note that you also have the opportunity to ask questions and to contribute to the program with your comments. Simply type them into the comment section below, WhatsApp us on 833-9886, or email us at jpourworldview@gmail.com. And please keep sharing this live and liking our page as we attempt to grow as organically as possible. We appreciate your help and your support. And now on to our main program. This week, as we said at the beginning, we're talking about women in politics. Recently, we've seen an upsurge in the number of women leading Western countries or getting into leadership positions politically in Western countries. And I specify Western countries because women have been dominant in the governmental leadership roles in the global South for some time. However, since we are dominant or dominated really by the Western media, it sometimes appears as though this is a new phenomena. So let us examine this. As a Black feminist, I'm especially interested in Black women in politics, taking on roles that are traditionally held by men. And I'm interested in how this affects other Black women, either directly or indirectly. Last week, I spoke about the overwhelming amount of Black women who coalesced to get Biden-Harris elected. And I'll call their names again. Kamala got overwhelming support from her AKA sisters and other sorority sisters. Stacey Adams brought out some 80,000 new voters in Georgia to flip the state. Patrisse Cullors and Melissa Garcia, who both co-founded Black Lives Matter, turned the pressure group into a real political movement and got to work on bringing out voters old and new. Then we had Charlene Curators, who's the national director of the Black Youth Project, renowned activist and academic Angela Davis, and we even had celebrities like Rihanna, Cardi B, Beyonce, and countless others who used their superstar status, their social media power to rally for and elect the Biden-Harris team. In the end, some 95% of Black women voted for the Democrats in this election. So, Dr. Hinds, what is it about Black women that makes them so effective in the political arena? And why do they view their power to vote and affect the political process as so incredibly important?
That's That's an interesting question. I think it is a question that perhaps may be more specific to, let's say, countries in which Black women or Black people are minorities. Because if we are talking about our politics in the Caribbean, certainly these Black women make up half or more, in many cases, of the eligible voters and of the population. So, this is nothing, although women do not generally make up any majority across the Caribbean in terms of our representatives, they don't in most places in Africa either, apart from Rwanda being the most notable example. I think women have always played very important roles in political parties and in political systems, even if this is behind the scenes. So even in the United States of America, where this is the first time we are seeing a woman, a Black woman, a woman of color, because she's also of mixed heritage, rise to these heights in the political system. One of the things that I found interesting in the US context is the extent to which Black women have been important in the Democrat Party over time. So I think what we are seeing is that women are increasingly willing to step from the background and to take some chances at the forefront of politics and our political systems in terms of representative politics, because that is only the tip of the iceberg when we're talking about participation in politics. So as you mentioned, Black Lives Matters, Me Too movement, all of these sorts of activities are actually very political activities. The women's movement in itself was and continues to be a political movement for change around the world.
Yeah, that's true. I guess you can say that the Black women in particular are kind of the engine of the Democratic Party. It seems to me that they are
the Democrat Party in the U.S.
Right,
not Democratic Labour Party.
Well, probably them.
Well, maybe of that one too.
Yeah, but yeah, the Democratic Party in the United States. I guess you can that's a fair statement to say that they are Black people in general, but Black women in particular, given the numbers that vote for the Democrats in the United States. But I guess despite the the seeming victory, because Trump is questioning it, seeming victory of the Biden-Harris campaign and the elevation of Kamala Harris to the high office of vice president, hopefully in a couple weeks, actually, right? We still continue to see in the United States and in a number of other Western democracies, so-called, a underrepresentation of Black women in particular, women in general, but Black women in particular, as compared to the proportion that they represent in the population. We continue to see an underrepresentation of them in political high offices. What are some of the steps that those countries can look to take to try to ameliorate this perennial issue of underrepresentation? Bearing in mind that representation, of course, is an important factor.
This is quite a big issue because there are multiple factors at play here. So one has to do with the culture of politics itself. So the culture of politics is not one that is always very easy for women to become involved in, particularly at the forefront. So here we are talking about, even if we want to just look at this small election that we had in Barbados last week in St. George North, this required a lot of hours on the ground. This required for people to take a lot of time away from their families, away from their other kinds of duties, perhaps in the community, in schools if they have children, if they take care of older parents or family members. So this is very time intensive. And what we know is that despite many of the changes that we have seen in our society and around the world that have allowed women to enter the professions, to be more educated, to do all kinds of jobs, not just the professions, diverse jobs, there still generally is an expectation that much of this care work is the work that women will perform. And even without being told this, so nobody necessarily tells people, women may feel the socialization process, right? A sense of obligation to do these things. So being actively involved in this sort of politics means not being able to do some of these things in the ways that you otherwise would have done them. So this makes this decision very difficult. I found it really interesting when Grenville Phillips actually talked about retiring, and he said that his family would be happy. And you know, this is true, right? Because you have to take a lot of time away from your family members and from other activities to do this. And our politics are not set up, certainly not at the time of elections, to be very supportive of this. And I am not sure the extent to which our family structures are set up to be supportive of this either, considering if we look at the Caribbean, for instance, that many of our households are female headed and single parents. Right. So this means that there is a lot of other sorts of support that would be necessary to make this more possible, especially if you are looking at people who, at women who have families, so who have children or who may have parents to take care of and these kinds of responsibilities. So if you want to have diverse types of women in politics, then there need to be diverse types of supports, and the whole culture of politics needs to change. And this is not just the society, but also within political parties as well. So that the expectation that everybody is going to be able to participate in the same way to show their commitment to the party may not be fair if you are looking to include different kinds of people. And we could take this beyond women. So if you talk about feminism as a movement for equality, right, then we can look well beyond that, because we could ask ourselves questions, for instance, about whether or not there are people with disabilities who may be good for politics, but the structure of our system does not make it very possible for them to participate. So people with different types of abilities, skills, with different sorts of backgrounds are not able to enter politics because of, formal elective politics, because of the way in which the system is structured. And then if you are successful, this continues, because the sorts of hours that one needs to maintain in order to do this work properly are not hours that are very conducive to having a decent family life, unless you have a wife yourself, right? So, or you might have a supportive husband, but I have a colleague who always said she would like to have a wife so that she can have some of the supports that I suppose.
It's funny that you, because I was going to ask you a similar question along that line, because commentators often put forward that the savagery of politics as a reason why fewer women traditionally enter politics. But is that gender bias? Is it a throwback to, if you will, when the time when women were diagnosed with hysteria, like we can't handle somebody saying a harsh word to us? And is it really just a matter of what you were talking about earlier about socialization and what women view their responsibilities as being the child rearers and looking after the home and so forth? Or do you think that a lot of women wouldn't enter politics because of the skullduggery and so forth?
I think that is also part of it. And again, I say when we take, if we take a gender appraisal of this, there are many people who would not be interested in politics because formal politics is not just based on a masculine model, but a certain type of masculine model as well. So you have to, or the expectation is that you live up to certain views of what is power and what is being a leader. And not everybody who would make a good representative is willing to do some of that. So I think, again, as I said, the culture of politics needs to change. What I find helpful and heartening is that it is changing to some degree. So some of these kinds of attacks that we've heard on political platforms are being called out by many people across Barbados, across the region, and around the world, because they find them in poor taste. So these changes are occurring, and I think this would allow for more people to feel comfortable to put themselves forward without thinking that they're going to be unfairly attacked, that their characters are going to be damaged in the public eye. And there are particular ways in which sometimes this can happen that may be more offensive for women than perhaps maybe the case for men. I remember when Portia Simpson Miller was running, one of the comments that I heard was asking Jamaica if they want a petticoat government. You know, that's a really kind of offensive to me way of talking about having women in politics, as if, you know, the type of undergarment has something to do with the character of the leadership or the government. And this would still be a government, and it was still a government in which, good evening. It was still a government in which the majority were men. Yeah. So even when we do have women rise to the top, a lot of the time men still form the majority of the representatives. So some of this has to change.
Sorry, all of us want to say.
Go ahead, Ayo.
So I was asking, is the tone of politics changing, especially on the political platforms and so forth? Is it changing, and is it being called up more because there are more women in politics, and therefore it's having that positive change on the way politics is expressed?
I think it is changing because we are changing. It is changing here. I'm not sure how much it's changed in the US because
I think she dropped out for a bit.
Yeah.
Just give it a minute and see what happens.
Yeah. I mean, it was an interesting point. I think
a lot of change, but certainly, have I dropped out?
Yeah, you're here again. Let's repeat what you were saying.
Yeah, let's go.
Oh, I was saying that in the context of the US elections, we can see that things did not change a lot, especially from the Trump platforms.
Right.
There were still some things, and not just platforms, other forums that he tends to use, Twitter and all kinds of things. This has not changed, but we do see this change in other places, so that when some of these comments are made, they're called out. In the 2018 election in Barbados, I think one of the things that did a lot of damage to the Democratic Labour Party, in addition to their 8 years of tenure, were some of the comments that were made on the platform about women in particular, and not just about women, about people who have different sexual orientations outside of, I guess, what is our expectation. So here we're talking about gay community. And I think we've started to get to a place where this is tolerated less and less. So this is a good thing for encouraging women to be involved in formal politics. But I still think that there is a lot that needs to be changed inside of political parties, the hours that are kept. When you get into parliament, I don't know that there are any provisions for assistance to not just women, because women are not the only people with families or who are responsible for children, but also to allow the men to take some responsibility for children and for their child care roles while doing the work of the people of a particular country. So that we do not have any provisions for child care facilities connected to our parliament across the region. This would be something that would be useful, not just for women, but for anyone who has a family. And we need to start moving away from this view that providing childcare support and support for caring functions is an assistance to women alone, because it reinforces that kind of view that this is the responsibility for women, right? So in order to have them in politics, we need to give them some things so that they can be involved.
What about the prospect of introducing policies such as, say, maternity leave?
Quotas?
Leave for quotas is another option, but also along the same vein that you were discussing just now, they put in policies in place that will help to encourage the males in society to take up their child care, elderly care responsibilities. For instance, I don't know if we have policy of, say, maternity or
paternity leave?
Yeah, paternity leave for men, right? Is that on the radar in the case of Barbados? And would that go a long way to addressing this perception out there that by ensuring the responsibility for child care lies with the female as opposed to with the male?
I think it would be helpful. I know there are some discussions in Barbados towards this, but this cannot work in isolation because people have to also believe that it is part of their responsibility. There are some men that still refer to things like maternity leave as a baby vacation. So they believe that their employees are taking some kind of vacation because I had this little baby and is an inconvenience for them because they have to look to find somebody now to fill this spot for 3 months or however long. And what's quite instructive is if we look at New Zealand, we actually have a prime minister who took maternity leave, who had a child while in office. And I think that's really a wonderful example for women who are aspiring to take part in politics, to know that this is something that is possible, that you do not have to be, because what we generally see if we look at women in politics is that many of the women who get involved in formal politics tend to do this after their children have reached a certain age, or they do not have children. And that is very much connected to getting past the part where the intensity of this childcare role is critical for the lives of children. Or if you don't have children, then it is not an issue. So, but we see, if we look at men in politics, they have children of any age. They have babies. No, seriously, they do, any age, right? Because the assumption and the fact is that someone else is taking care of them. And not just that someone else is taking care of them. I don't want to make it seem that the men who are involved in politics are not taking care of their children. But the gender roles that we have accepted in the region mean that our expectations for what men do to take care of children are different from our expectations about what women should be doing to take care of children. So we tend to expect a more hands-on approach, a very involved role. If you go to a swim meet, a music recital, ballet, PTA meetings, you are going to see a lot more women than men. And this seems like it's something that's not connected to politics, right? But if women are spending a lot of their time in PTA meetings and at swim meets, and they may have very good leadership possibilities and potential, but they are not going to put them towards formal politics because they're doing other things. So we limit the pool that we can pull from because of the way in which our societies and our politics are structured.
Yeah, I hear your point on that, because I mean, I sit here in the UK and we have a prime minister who is still counting the amount of children he has. I mean, who knows, right? And I'm sure he's not playing an active role in, well, I don't want to get into that. But on you raised the point of quotas. Are those the quota, is that another type of policy that we could see emanating from, say, a Barbados Party government shortly, or I say any government in the region really, that can help us to move to the position whereby we have fair representation across the board in the highest offices of the land? Do you see that coming out?
I don't know if it will result, but quotas have been very effective in terms of increasing the numbers. So there are different types of quotas that you can have. You can have quotas for the inside of the political party, which means that you can have legislation, for instance, that says that in order for a political party to participate in a general election, there needs to be a certain proportion of the candidates who are women. Mm-hmm. So this does not mean that the women will be elected, but it certainly means that the political parties will be obligated to look for women who are viable candidates. So if we are talking here in Barbados about 30 seats up for election, perhaps we might say 10 of the candidates, 10 of the 30.
Mm-hmm. A minimum.
Yes, exactly, a minimum. So it's usually, the emphasis is usually on a significant minority, around a third. Mm-hmm. But because we cannot have, a third of a human being, we would go towards. So we can't have 33.3% of a human being. So we get to as close to there as we can, right? Yeah. So that is something that's useful. A lot of the literature says that this usually works better in proportional representation systems, right, with lists in which there may be some insistence that women are placed every other instead of at the bottom of the list, right? So, because if you place them at the bottom, it means that if a large proportion of the population does not vote for your slate of candidates, women automatically will not get in. So it may be every other or every three. Mm-hmm. There's still the concern that if you have quotas, that women may be put in seats that they're not likely to win. Right. So you might put them to run against someone who is in a sure seat. Mm-hmm. So yes, you meet your quota requirements. There are also some issues in some places where the penalties for not fielding the correct amount of women candidates are too weak, so that some political parties are happy to pay the fine rather than to do the necessary work to get the number. In Barbados, we did sign up to, I can't remember the year, to the Beijing platform, I think in 1996, quite some time ago though, which committed us, along with many countries in the region, to trying to get at least a third of those who are represented in our representative politics to be women. And what we have generally done in Barbados and across the region to try and get close to that is to use the nominated positions in the Senate, as opposed to really focusing on finding viable candidates who are women as well as men. So this is a recruitment issue in some ways. So there are lots of ways you can have quotas, and I think they would be useful, but the counter arguments against them have to do with you may stop men who are viable candidates from running, and this should be on the basis of merit and not a quota. And why just women? Why stop at women if you're going to have quotas? Why not have for indigenous people in some places, they would say? Why not for people from LGBTQ plus communities? Why not? So when you start talking about quotas, there are some other issues that can arise. Why not? In our case, it may be less of an issue, but why not minorities you'll get in some other places?
Right.
So there are other issues that can arise if you use a quota system, but they certainly have been effective in increasing the numbers of women who are involved in elective politics.
Right. So that, going on that angle, might be Pandora's box, because then other people will be asking for fairer representation, which, you know, we may not be against, but our system, as you suggest, might not be well suited to this type of thing. Ayo, you have any questions for Dr. Hinds?
On quotas, do you think when he was in Owen Arthur, the late Owen Arthur, when he was in, do you think that he did a good job in terms of getting more women into politics and mentoring them through, even including our current Prime Minister? Because you had the Lynette Eastmans and a number of other women that he would have brought into politics. And how do you think that stacked up against like having a particular quota in the government?
I think it was helpful. I really cannot speak about the extent to which the late Prime Minister Owen Arthur actively sought out women, or if he was just impressed by talent. And what I suspect is that he was impressed by talent, and he was perhaps not concerned if the talent was male or female. And I think that's quite a good attitude for us to have. But when there's a visible disparity, I think sometimes we do have to actively look to encourage people to get involved in things, because it may not be lack of talent, it may be things like lack of confidence and, you know, lack of belief that particular people are suited for politics, that they want to get involved in this dirty game. And if we listen to some of what Prime Minister Motley said about, and Tony Moore herself said about entering or deciding to enter elective politics, it really does not sound as if Ms. Moore thought that she was someone who was, you know, really suited for this. And as we see, she had quite an impressive win. So there are things that can be done, again, in terms of recruitment. And when it comes to quotas, one of the things I would like to leave you all with as well is, that's my son, the fact that quotas don't have to just be legislated.
Right.
So what has existed in some of the Scandinavian countries, I can't remember which one it was, that in which a political party put in place a voluntary quota.
Oh.
And what is interesting about that is that when one party does it, the other political parties don't want to seem as if they're regressive. So not everything needs to be legislated. So
Right.
if the Barbados Labour Party or the Democratic Labour Party, if one of them said, we are going to put in place a quota for this, the other party may feel motivated to have either a quota or to have an active policy or approach towards recruiting women so that they will not look as if they're not progressive. So this kind of competitive recruitment can encourage further recruitment. So legislating quotas is not the only way. There are voluntary quotas that can be used and that have been successful in making these things a matter of course, so that there's generally an expectation in some political systems now that there should be a certain proportion of women who are involved, and so much so that it becomes normal.
Right.
Yeah.
So again, sorry.
No, go ahead, Ayo.
We got a few questions here from Anti-America. He seems to have followed you over.
Hello.
Hello. But I'm going to ask one in particular. Some of the others I'm not going to touch. But I'm going to ask one in particular. He's asking why women, why is there a focus on getting women into politics? Why not farmers or manufacturers or something else? Why is there a gender slant? Why is focus on getting women in particular into politics?
Well, you know, women can be farmers and manufacturers as well as can men. So women are not just defined by their sex or gender roles. They also have varied roles that they play in society. So there's nothing that says having more women in politics means that there will not be people in manufacturing or tourism or farmers or anything of the sort. In fact, it might lead to some variety in terms of some perhaps more unusual types of fields being seen in elective politics. Nurses, maybe. So perhaps some of the areas in which women may dominate, we may see them coming into elective politics. People may raise questions about, you know, if some of these jobs are suited for politics. And my question always is, what is this job definition of a politician? Because it certainly is not just a lawyer. I never saw that anywhere. When you look at our constitutions, you need to reach a certain age and to have a fairly clean criminal record. So it doesn't have to be fully clean. You could have been in prison for a short time period. So these are the basic requirements. Once you meet those, you can go forward for elective politics. So why women? Because we need to see all kinds of people representing us. And it's not just about the numbers either, because you certainly can have women involved in elective politics that can have some very regressive and patriarchal views that are not necessarily helpful to women. So it's not enough to have one or two or a few. You need to have variety so that you have different sorts of perspectives that come forward, because there are very many women who are involved in supporting patriarchy. And they can do that from inside of the halls of government. And we see that in the Republican Party in the United States of America. Certainly, some of the women who are involved in political processes may not be the most progressive if we are thinking about gender equality in a more radical way, which goes beyond just seeing women in different places.
Yeah, I mean, the question could be turned on its head. Why not women, right? Because, I mean, we see women in leadership positions. I mean, I've had several bosses now, and the better ones have always been women. I prefer female leadership. So, I mean, why not, right? Why not in the highest offices of the land, right? Why not? Right,
and I wanted to give you all some numbers too, if it is helpful, because I think there is this perception that women are doing so well in politics these days. And they are, compared to the times when they were almost absent, but they really aren't in the grand scheme of things. So if we look at the participation or the representation of women globally, we are talking 24.3% of all national parliaments. So that is less than a quarter. And if we break this down by region, we still see really low kinds of numbers. Rwanda actually being the country in the world with the highest number of women parliamentarians, with 61.3%. And this is a result, again, of an active policy, a quota system, to place women in this position. So in the absence of this, we tend to get some very low numbers, including in our region. In the Americas, we're dealing with 30.6%. And in Barbados, we are not at that. So because we have women, and this is a bit unusual to have multiple women in our parliament, we seem to think that, oh, the women are taking over or something. But we know that there are 30 representatives that we have here, and 15 of them are not women. They just aren't. So because the prime minister is a woman and there are other women in there, does not mean that the job is done. We need to get to a place, in my opinion, where people are not even bothered about this.
I agree. Yeah, I can't see it really being, like I said, you know, I've experienced female leadership all my life and it is good. So anti-America, you know, get on board.
I'm sure he's experienced female leadership too, even if it's at home.
Well, there you go.
And if he hasn't,
Most of us have.
No.
All right, so Dr. Hinds, so as we welcome another woman into the House of Assembly, though, so we now have the incoming member will be a woman for St. George North. And what does this mean for political life in Barbados? You know, are we getting closer to that ideal of having fairness? Because I think this is all people are asking for. We're not asking for women to take over. We just want to have fairness in representation, which is important with regards to the highest offices of the land. So what is this incumbent? The incumbent for St. George North being a woman, what does this mean?
Well, we have to see what will happen. I think, as I said, it is good for people, for younger people, especially to see this and to accept it. Hopefully for younger people, it will become more normal to see a woman being elected as a candidate. And this will be less of a talking point as we go on. This doesn't mean that even if we ever reach 50-50 point or even beyond that there should be any complacency, because what I have experienced, for instance, is that when women are minorities in something, it is always good to say, oh, look, well, you know, we have a few women here, but when that table is turned around and women are a majority where they once were a minority, men tend to get very frustrated and worried about the decline of men in society and what is happening with the men, and this is not healthy, right? But you know, sometimes this can happen. We need to get to a place where it's okay sometimes that there are more women than men, just as it has been okay. Many of us have accepted that it's all right to have a government that has more men in it than women, because the men care about the women, and even if they don't have the same experiences, they will go and try and find out so that they are fair. We need to get to a point so that if we ever have more women than men, the women should be expected, and people should assume that women are going to care about men and care about the views and the concerns of many people in our society. But I think it's a very thin kind of view and shallow to think that an increase in the number of women alone is going to lead to equality, because this is a very kind of superficial measure. We need to look at the sorts of things that the women who are involved in politics will do. And we need to look at the same thing for men too, because it's just like saying, just because there are Black people in the parliament or Black people in government does not mean that they will necessarily do things that are helpful for deeper progression of Black people in a country.
And can you talk about some of those things? Because I agree with you that we say, well, we need more women in politics, we need more women in leadership, we need more women at the top of organizations and so forth. But then it still does not, in a lot of cases, translate to more women overall benefiting.
Well, I can give you a very good example, and that has to do with COVID-19. So we have a woman who is a prime minister. We have a woman who is in charge of, I can't remember the full name now, the ministry that deals with elder care and social, it used to be Ministry of Social Care.
Yeah, I know.
But, and we have a woman in charge of education. And if we look at COVID-19, what we saw was that a lot of the responses were in healthcare and the economy. And these other areas that are very important to women in particular, but not exclusively, because of their caring roles, important to families, were not really addressed in ways that I thought were adequate. So we know that the economy is important, but in order for the economy to function in a pandemic, there are other social measures that need to be put in place. If you are going to have a lockdown in a country, if you're going to have a series of curfews, there are some things that we need to pay some very serious attention to, knowing that already in Barbados and across the Caribbean, we have some of the highest instances of things like child sexual abuse.
Mm-hmm.
And what you do when you have a curfew and you have people forced into the household who may already be suffering from some of these things is that you make them more vulnerable to this. And as much as we knew about a helpline that you could call for, or a hotline that you could call for COVID, I thought that the response was very late and under-publicized when it came to dealing with other things such as abuses, child abuse, as well as domestic violence in particular. When people, we may not think of it, but when people get to go to work every day or to leave the home, this is a bit of a refuge from what may be going on inside of the household. And COVID-19 posed a lot of stresses for people. People were losing their jobs, and even if they had not lost their jobs, because things were closed, it may have meant that people who rely on going to work every single day in order to be paid did not have disposable income, and it's a stressful situation too. So we could have seen, and around the world, we have seen an escalation in domestic violence. In Barbados, there have been, according to the National Organization of Women, there were increased calls. I think if you speak to some attorneys, they may also tell you about some of their experiences. So, and this was not at the forefront. So I'm not saying that the government did not put things in place, because they did. But what was at the forefront of our discussion was, how are we going to get the economy running? Mm-hmm. And even now that we are back to normal-ish, kind of, the places that we have closures are still in these areas that are very problematic for women to deal with. When you have schools online and hybrid and a couple of days a week and this kind of thing, and people are still expected to go to work. So we can hear a lot about how much money is going into support the tourism industry. We can hear about how much money is going to be put in to support small businesses. We can hear about all of these things, but in our politics, these things are treated kind of like they're secondary issues. They're important, but without the economy up and running, then we cannot function. So these things have to be, you know, top of mind. These have to be our top priorities. And I think that if we have more women in politics and these things are not addressed, then we are not really getting to the core of some of the gender issues that our political system needs to address.
And by address, you mean have them addressed more publicly?
We need to have policy. We need to have policies in place for these things. Right now, there are very few workplaces, including in the government, where there are provisions made for childcare. You want to have 24-hour clinics, but no 24-hour childcare. And when we talk about clinics being open for 24 hours, a lot of the people that work in these clinics are women. So you make and some of the things that I heard coming from our political leadership about focusing on community, and we have to get back to our good old ways. This is not adequate. This is not policy. You're telling people, you gotta go and bread for yourself then, right? So find a neighbor, find a friend, find somebody to help you take care of your children. That is the community way. That's the good old Bajan way. So the government does not feel a sense of obligation to deal with that with policy, but it feels a sense of obligation to help the private sector to make money. Why not tell them to bread for themselves too, right? Get back to the good industrious capitalist way of doing what you need to do for yourself. I'm not saying that this is what they should do, but there are different sectors in our society that require support. And this continuous assumption that we have that things that tend to be women's roles will automatically somehow, like there's a magic fairy in the background, be taken care of, and you do not require a policy intervention. This is inadequate. And this has been consistent. We've seen this when they had structural adjustment programs in the 1980s across the Caribbean, the 1980s and the 1990s, that a lot of the cuts went into social spending, and a lot of the voluntary and free labor of women was what we ended up relying on across the region to ensure that children were taken care of, that our grandparents and parents are taken care of, and that societal functions are addressed. And I don't think that's adequate. We need to be as serious about these sides of our policy as we are about the perhaps strictly, these are also part of the economy, right? But the, you know, more strictly economic areas of our countries. And this is not just about women, this is really about development. So if our development is to mean something besides GDP per capita and how much foreign direct investment we get and how good the roads look and buildings, we need to look at other sides. And the assumption is that if you put more women in politics, these things will be addressed. But I do not see that as a reality, because the women themselves have to be thinking in a different way. And we cannot assume that just because you put a female body in a political office, that their thinking is different. You can have men who you put in certain positions who perhaps are more aware of some of the gender dynamics and may be better able to address some of these things than some women. I spoke a lot. Sorry.
Well, thank
That's
you.
fine. But I don't want you to move on yet, because I'm actually agreeing with you a lot on these issues. Throughout wars and so forth, we've seen women having to come to the fore to make bombs and do all types of stuff that when the world is not at war, we can say COVID is a war of sorts, that women aren't necessarily thought of. And so that is why that in times of peace, then we must be legislating and having policy to protect women in those situations.
And I would say not just protect women, because there is a kind of way in which we take the agency away from women when we say to protect them, but to ensure that everyone in our society has a fair chance. And so if you want to talk about the newly elected representative in St. George North, Ms. Moore, one of the things I heard her say in the debate, or I don't want to pretend that I can quote from this debate, but when they were talking about domestic violence, she kept talking about the role of the family and the consequences of domestic violence on the family. And this was a reasonable answer. But to me, it does not go far enough. Because if I don't have any children, if I don't have a sister, if I'm an only child, this is not about the consequences on any family. It is violence that is unacceptable and it is a crime. And in the same way that we do not want to have people being shot and killed and to face violence because it is a problem for the society, it is inhumane. This is not just about the consequences on the family and if children see the violence. Yes, that is also important, but the fact that you have a criminal act of violence being perpetrated by one person against another inside of a private space, often, this is a problem in itself. Whether or not children are involved, it's not just about the children. And I think sometimes when we look at how domestic violence is treated, a lot of the emphasis tends to be on, oh yes, it is bad that we don't want people to be brutalized and so on, but then the children have seen it too. We know that this is bad, but it cannot just be about the family. Women are important as individuals. They're not property. They're not, functions of the family, so that when they are harmed, the consequences on the family need to be our concern. Yes, that is our concern, but the violence, the psychological effects of this are just as important as any other type of violence that we see in our society. And we live in a very, very violent society. And perhaps our crime statistics don't reflect it adequately because we separate things like domestic violence and child abuse from violent crimes, when these are also very violent crimes that require an urgent policy approach, just as gun violence requires an urgent policy approach. And the 25th of November is the start of 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. So it's, maybe that's a little bit why that's at the forefront of my mind. But, just to say that women are as important as men. And some of these arguments about, the women that aggravate the men, and sometimes they have come, some of these things I have heard coming from the parliament and parliamentarians and even women inside of parliament. And it has been so troubling to me to hear that, and to hear women in parliament talking about, well, this other woman in parliament does not have children. So, you know, just the fact of having women does not get us away from some of these really problematic gender beliefs.
Right.
It's an overall education that is needed, an overall viewpoint of why this is important and what it means and so forth. I think sometimes.
Yeah. A lot of these views seem very antiquated. They seem very old. They seem very ancient.
Which view? What view?
The views such as, you know, that the woman is not an agent in her own, in herself, that violence perpetrated against her should somehow be viewed through the lens of the impact, the secondary impacts that it has on the family and the children. These things seem a little of yesteryear. And so I'm hopeful, and I want to get your take on this, Dr. Hinds, whether you view that the incoming, the new generations of politicians and people in public life, whether this is going to change the idea that a lot of these antiquated ideas that, you know, women, if a woman doesn't have any children, that somehow she's less capable of implementing policies that speak to childcare and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm. I hope so. And I think we're all works in progress. So hopefully as people learn more and learn to think differently, they will start to do so. People won't, everybody's not going to embrace everything that they hear, but I think it is important to allow people to hear things that may cause them some discomfort. Perhaps it causes discomfort because we know we've done some of these things ourselves. But this is one of the ways in which we can grow. So I think that we may tolerate some behaviors from our politicians that we need to talk about. We may not be calling their names, but we need to talk about these behaviors being negative and things that we do not want to tolerate any longer, so that they can start to do better. And those who are aspiring to be in political office also start thinking about their behaviors. So we need to become a society, for instance, that does not want to tolerate people in our elective roles or in the Senate who abuse women or who abuse their partner, because it may be some other kind of relationship as well. It may be a same-sex relationship, two men, two women. So we don't want to tolerate that. We don't want to tolerate people who have been accused, and for whatever reason, they have some kind of cloud hanging over their head relating to sexual abuse and sexual harassment. So these are not things that we are going to tolerate any longer. And I know being a politician is difficult. Your life may be under a microscope, but there are certain things we may need to start calling out people on, not necessarily by name, but behaviors as being unacceptable, so that we start to have a culture that if we see some kind of, in Antigua and Barbuda, I think it was recently, that the prime minister has placed some distance between himself and one of the cabinet members who has an allegation. I think this needs to start becoming regularized so that people do not believe that they can get away with what they can get away with. And also so that those who are affected by it know that they can say, this person has done this to me, without feeling like they're going to be victimized in society because this person's a big up.
Right. And you would think that this should be easy for us as Black people in particular to do, because, you know, we were once as a whole oppressed, and you would think that we should be as a whole against oppression in any form, whether it be race-based or gender-based oppression. But it seems that it seems as though it's a harder case to be made than should be the case in our case.
Well, as I said, we're all works in progress, and there are different layers of privilege that people experience. So when we talk about women in politics, for instance, we cannot assume that there are not some women who have some privileges, because I, for instance, am one of the people that you will say has had a lot of privileges, and I cannot understand some things. I have not experienced certain things, and this is true. And we need to acknowledge that privilege may blind us to some things. And men in our societies, even though they are Black men that face a lot of discrimination, they still also experience many privileges that they may not even appreciate, because they may take it for granted that this is how everybody lives their lives.
Right.
And it's not something that people are consciously doing. It's just that they're unaware until they perhaps are put in a position to hear what it feels like to be in another experience. So, you know, there are a lot of things that all of us can do. There's this notion in feminism of intersectionality. This is a term developed by Kimberly Crenshaw in the United States of America. She's a lawyer. And this notion of intersectionality has to do with not just thinking that each group is the same because it is, you know, it has something in common. So Black women are the same, so we can treat to Black women in a particular way, when we know that there are many layers of difference to that. There are some people who have grown up from and have come from very privileged backgrounds, and there are others who have not. There are people who work in different areas, they've experienced different things, and these intersections influence how policies affect people and how people live in this world. And we say the same thing for men when we're talking about intersections, so that every man is not going to be able to enter politics, because some, even if they are good at community work, they may not be able to present themselves in a way that we view as acceptable for political office. They may be talking in pure Bajan dialect all the time. They may not dress in the way we think they can dress, even if they're very active in their community. So we all need to acknowledge that we have certain privileges, and to try and see how this affects the ways in which we do things. And if we look at Kamala Harris as an example, I think she certainly has less than a stellar record, some would assert, when it comes to how many men, Black men, were incarcerated under her tenure in the United States of America. And I think that although this has been used as a criticism of her, and justly, that listening to her, unless she's trying to trick us all, which is also a possibility, I think that she has really started to understand and acknowledge some of the problems in the assumptions that she made about crime and how to deal with it effectively. And these assumptions came from a place of privilege and really ignorance, and not ignorance to say that this woman is ignorant in any way, very intelligent, but just not understanding certain realities and experiences. And I think our politics tends to be so harsh that there's not a lot of emphasis on really understanding, apart from when you're canvassing and you want to understand that somebody got bills to pay and help them so you can get their vote.
So I guess understanding and being able to empathize with the other person too, being able to put yourself in their shoes and view life, all right, try to experience life vicariously through them, you know, see what it's like to be in the position of someone who may be physically not as strong, and being put upon by, you know, someone else. You know, how would you feel if, you know, you were being battered, for instance? You know, you would not appreciate that. So perhaps abusing women in your household is not a good thing, right? So things like these.
But people who have privileges don't like to give them up, right? So people that are accustomed doing certain things will not feel very happy about having quotas, right? So if you're accustomed to using an old boys network and for things to work in certain ways, and you're accustomed to being able to call people sweetheart and say the office and that kind of thing, then when you have sexual harassment legislation put in place in the workplace, a lot of people were really bothered, but you can't make a joke in here, no, you know, because these were things that they become accustomed to, and it's a privilege. And when you start to take away people's privileges, they're not happy about it. They think that you become in a very touchy, or we would say touchless society. You can't say nothing, you can't make a joke, or they got feminists in here, you can't say certain things. But you need to be able to say some of these things, and in the workplace, on the block, wherever you are, as well as in the parliament, because some of the statements that are made and on the platform need to be checked.
Are there any questions from the audience for Dr. Hinds?
We have a number of comments, but not a lot of
Okay.
questions
Anything
today.
else from
What comments do they have? Anything
Just
good?
comments agreeing with you. Basically, there's just a lot of agreement with you. Somebody was saying, why do you think it is that Jill Biden is the first lady with a paid day job, considering previous first ladies, Michelle Obama, are intelligent, accomplished, and may have had successful careers before their husbands took office? Doesn't it boil back down to the issue Dr. Hinds previously referenced, where they may not have the necessary support system to be able to balance both worlds, basically, work and being first lady and so forth? I guess she's saying
Why
that,
don't they keep their jobs?
I think that she's thinking that Jill has more flexibility than Michelle. I'm not sure, but I think that's what she's trying to say. And she can correct me. You can correct me, Rochelle, if I'm wrong on what you're trying to explain. But she's saying, why do you think it is that Jill Biden is the first lady with a paid job, considering previous first ladies, for example, Michelle Obama, who was intelligent and accomplished and may have had a successful career before her husband taking office? Does it not boil back down to the issue that you, Dr. Hinds, were previously referencing, where they may not have had the necessary support to balance it?
I don't know. Maybe.
Perhaps.
Maybe not. Maybe it's a
maybe.
choice.
But you would think that, you know, the first lady would would have the necessary support, though.
Yeah.
Maybe
you can use that
cultural.
office too.
Yeah, maybe it's more cultural, and it was like an expectation, a societal expectation that they give up their other roles, which is a part of the problem, I guess. Right.
But they can also use the office of the first lady, of the president of the United States, as well as now we have the second gentleman.
Yeah.
They can use these offices to do a lot of work. So it may not be the same kind of work that they were doing, but they can do very important work in the country, and they have staff and support that will allow them to do it. So it is an opportunity to do different types of work that they would not have otherwise been able to do. It's just whether or not it's how they make use of this office to do some sorts of work.
Yeah, I guess it was interpreting the question along the line of, say Michelle Obama, she was in a career, a very prominent lawyer, and she had to more or less give that up. And I do remember at the time, the right in particular exhibiting some sort of pressure on her that, you know, she has to fulfill the role of the traditional first lady, which means you have to give up your career and transition to this position. So I was interpreting the question along that line. So anyway,
That may be the right interpretation.
Yeah, it probably is, but I can't imagine how anybody could do a job and be living in the White House with the President of the United States. I feel that is a job in itself. Yeah.
All right, somebody's asking, some companies here in Barbados have paternity leave, and they believe the government will totally implement it within the next 5 years, and this is a good thing. That's just a statement, not necessarily a question.
Okay.
We hope so.
Yeah. So, Dr. Hinds, question.
Yes.
Unless you want to go ahead, Terry, you want to go ahead?
Well, you said you had a question. I'm going to take the topic away from this one. So if you want to move on, then they can ask the question.
Okay, you want to move on to the other topic then, to the book, because we're halfway mark.
Do you want to? I think we still have a couple questions on the concerning, before we get to the book though, concerning the by-election, and I have a question concerning the leadership of Mr. Pizza. Given the massive victory for the Barbados Party, and obviously they lost, a number of commentators would have expected, or they were suggesting on this show and in other places, that a win for the Democratic Labour Party, a Pyrrhic victory, would be a return to, say, the 2013 results, which would be around, say, 40% share of the vote. And we see the Democratic Labour Party not even breaking 30% in this most recent election. Of course, the turnout was low, so that has to be taken into consideration, but the result still isn't very good as it relates to the performance in the by-election and what it might augur for Mrs. DePiza's leadership. Do you think her leadership is now in question in the Democratic Labour Party, or what do you think there?
I don't know that her leadership is in question because the Democratic Labour Party has an uphill battle.
Mm-hmm.
The defeat that they faced in 2018 should have shaken them all the way to their core, because it's not just that they were unable to win a seat. It is that we had the overwhelming proportion of the vote, I think it's close to 80%, went to the Barbados Labour Party. This is something that shows that they have a very deep hole to try and dig themselves out of. Now, sometimes what we see when we are discussing women in politics is that women may be put or may find themselves, let's say, in these kind of transitional roles where there is a lot of this very unrewarding work that needs to be done, and this rebuilding work that needs to be done. And I believe that Verla DePiza has found herself in this position. This is a position that I do not think anyone would want to be in, where what you have is that all of your previous candidates have been discredited. So you need to look for a whole new set of candidates. The image of the political party that brought Barbados independence, Errol Barrow is the father of the nation, and all these kind of things that we've heard. We have a political party that really needs to ensure that it continues to survive following 2018. And this is not easy work at all. So I don't think that this is an indictment, that the defeat is an indictment of her leadership. I think that what we will see at the end of 5 years will tell us something about her leadership as well as the Democratic Labour Party, including whether or not this is a party that is going to continue to survive and if it is still healthy. She has a lot of work to do. And the fact that she did win their internal election recently gone indicates that at least the members of the Democratic Labour Party do have some confidence in her. But this is a thankless job that she has right now. It really is. I think that she did make some miscalculations in the St. George North by-election. That said, the biggest one, in my opinion, was to say that this by-election would be a referendum on the government. From the time I heard that, I was like, no, that's the wrongest thing to say. Right. Because just like fixing all of the problems that need to be fixed in the Democratic Labour Party, winning this seat would require something close to a miracle.
Right.
I'm not saying that it is impossible, because everything is possible, right? But especially after the last election, it was very difficult. Even when the Democratic Labour Party was in power, they could not win this seat.
Yeah.
So expecting that following 8 years that people have not forgotten, you are going to come and capture this seat and it will be a referendum on the government is really a lot of exuberance, and perhaps it resulted from her victory at the party level. I don't know. Maybe it was just a miscalculation. Maybe it was. Pardon?
Was she still drunk?
I don't know that she was drunk or that she drinks, but probably still very enthusiastic and excited following that victory. Oh yes, drunk with excitement, certainly. But it's a very hard. I do not envy her. I don't know who in the Democratic Labour Party or any other political party would want to be in that position. But we have seen this, that women that play these transitional roles, sometimes the so-called, in the literature, they call it the widow's path. This is similar to this, where the wife of a deceased, very popular politician fills that space, not because this person is necessarily a political figure or even wants to be a political figure, but to just hold the space while the political party finds the candidate they need to replace the person, because the person is so overwhelmingly popular and you can get the sympathy vote and that kind of thing. Also, when we look at transitional governments coming out of conflicts, there is some evidence to suggest that people may be more open to having a woman as the leader in Northern Ireland, not in Northern Ireland, in Ireland, for instance, Northern Ireland, with Mary Robinson. She was one example. And also Ellen Johnson Sirleaf has been used as an example of that. The number of women in the parliament in Rwanda is also used as an example that when there are these tragedies that happen, people may be open, and that has again something to do with this gender dynamic too, right? You need a mother figure, and they use that kind of language also.
Piece the party back together again.
Yeah, exactly. And another example could be in Brexit as well. So that is perhaps a recent one where Theresa May was placed in an extremely difficult position, or was offered a very extremely difficult position, took it up, and was, you know, after a lot of this very dirty work was done, she's no longer the prime minister. So I think this is something that, this is not something that exclusively happens to women, but I think that women who are involved in politics need to educate themselves on the fact that this is something that occurs.
Right.
And ensure that if they are going to take certain positions at difficult times, that they do it in the full knowledge that they may be used to fill a space, you know, as a transitional kind of figure while there's rebuilding and reconstruction being done.
And on their own terms as well, because I don't know, obviously I have no idea what the internal machinations of the Democratic Labour Party are, and I don't get the impression that she has full grip on the party, and that may be something that she needs to look into going forward.
Yeah. You know, political parties are like any other organization. There are divisions. And there certainly were divisions under the Barbados Labour Party, even going into the 2018 election. But I think they have to be managed. And you need a skillful leader to do that. There are different ways of managing them. Sometimes the management is by purging, so getting rid of the troublemakers. And sometimes there are other ways of doing that. And this is part of the skill in leadership. I also don't want to assume that just because somebody is a woman means that they're going to be a good leader, or it means that they're going to be unfaired. But the same way in which we give, I guess we give men a chance to succeed or fail and leave it at that, we need to start giving women a chance to succeed or fail, and not say that, well, the failure is connected to the fact that the person is a woman. Because
do you think that there are special skills? I'm sorry. But do you think that there are special skill sets that are not special skill sets in terms of credentials and so forth, but by virtue of the fact that there are women that are different, that are different to their male counterparts, that causes them sometimes to react differently in certain situations? For instance, it's because I'm just going over some research, because sometimes some of it sometimes sounds a little bit, and I'm always cautious with it because I don't want to be gender biased. You understand? And thinking that just because somebody is a woman, it means that they are going to be more empathetic towards, let's say, some of the things that we were talking about earlier, women with children in a pandemic, or old women or old people during a pandemic and stuff like that. But for the most part, do you think that it makes a difference in certain instances?
I think it can, but the funny thing about politics is that it may tend to attract a certain type of personality, and that may mean whether male or female, there are certain sorts of behaviors that you may see. There may be people that enjoy having power, enjoy the spotlight, and those personality types that may be attracted, I'm not saying they always have to be the ones attracted to politics, may exhibit certain kinds of traits in common. There's some psychologists that think that politicians are really quite pathological and, you know, megalomaniacs, and, you know, that's why they tell a lot of lies, and narcissists, very vain. There may be some truth in that, but I would hope that we can move our politics away from this to ensure that people are being served and served well, and not just egos being served, and people are being served as a result of needing to stoke your own ego.
I agree
Right.
with those politics, with those psychologists, because I actually think there has to be some level of a huge ego involved because of the type of politics that is practiced. But if we were to change the way we practice our politics, then we will start to attract different types of people. Do you understand what I'm saying?
I do.
I
I
think
also know that we like a lot of things too that
Mm-hmm.
encourage that, because we like going to political meetings and enjoying ourselves.
Of course.
So we like to hear somebody up there talking a certain way, you know, like putting on a little peacock and thing. We don't just want somebody going to talk policy in a very polished kind of manner. We like to hear some
No,
old talk on the
yeah,
platform.
outside of that, I think the actual practice of politics in terms of
Hmm.
what we focus on and those types of things.
Yeah,
Yeah.
sure.
All right. So do you want to go to the do you want to go to the book now? We can go to just
Yeah.
briefly discuss. All right. So
And just let me remind the audience quickly, Terry, that they can send their questions through. I'm seeing a lot of comments, and I'm just going to tell you right now, are half the things that you're texting to me, I'm just not going to read. All right,
oh
go on,
boy.
Terry.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So just want to remind everyone. So Dr. Hinds has a new book entitled "Civil Society Organizations, Governance, and the Caribbean Community." Is available on Amazon, I think, in hardback and in Kindle. I got my
Yes, it's
Kindle.
also at the UE bookstore.
Well, yeah, it's there, but I was able to buy mine yesterday on Kindle, so so I'm able to answer
I
some
think it's
questions.
on sale right now as well.
It is?
Yeah.
Okay, well,
The
get your
price has been slashed both on Amazon as well as Palgrave's website. They have a sale Black Friday or something like that. And it's going on for a couple of weeks. So
now is a good time to buy, guys. All right, so there's a couple questions concerning the book. So in the book, you identify civil social organizations, CSO.
civil society
Yeah, civil
organizations.
society organizations, right?
Mm-hmm.
Civil society organizations as this type of entity, sometimes referred to as NGOs in the book. You also point to some person. This is NGOs, and you advance the idea that these type of organizations can help to enhance the governance in the domestic and regional levels, right? So I just want to have you identify what these type of organizations are and point to the ways in which they can help to improve our governance. I think we were speaking just now to politics and women and different things that we could different policies related to the government put in place. What are some of the roles that the CSOs can play in this regard as well?
Okay, thank you. Well, civil society organizations are, some people call them non-governmental organizations, but generally when we talk about non-governmental organizations, people may think more about some voluntary organizations, service-oriented, community groups, and so on. But civil society organizations can take us beyond that. We can include in there things like trade unions. Those are civil society organizations as well. We can look at private sector representative organizations. So not businesses, but organizations that may represent businesses. So for instance, the Barbados Hotel, Hotel and Tourism Association, Barbados Chamber of Commerce. These are also, they are not operating on the basis of the profit motive. They're not trying to make money. They are representing particular interests and concerns of their members. So generally, these are organizations that are not driven by the profit motive. They're nonprofits, and there are many different types of them, ranging from your book club, PTA, the Boy Scouts Association, Girl Guides, sporting federations. All of these are civil society organizations. And then there are the more professionalized ones as well. So there are a whole host of organizations that can be viewed as civil society organizations. Not all of them attempt to influence policy, or politics, but many times they do. So if we look at sporting organizations, for instance, so we can look at the various sporting federations and associations across the country. They may have particular interests in trying to get an audience with the Minister of Sports in order to address sport policy so that athletes can have better resources so that they can make careers out of sports. And also because there are particular social and community functions that sports can play that are very useful. If we want to turn to women's organizations again, these organizations have been very useful in advocating for legislative and policy changes. So they do play roles in politics. So that the only way to be involved in politics is not being in electoral politics or elective politics. You can be involved in other ways, and civil society organizations provide this kind of avenue. So when we are dealing with things such as domestic violence legislation, women's organizations in Barbados have been very active in seeking amendments to existing legislation, or being watchdogs as well, to ensure that certain things are enacted or are brought to life, not enacted, that have been enacted are actually implemented in reality, in doing things such as trying to engage with the police force, to have certain types of training, and to ensure that there is an understanding of how to treat to certain sorts of issues, and pushing for things such as having a family court. So these organizations do have roles to play in politics. They do have, we all know of the private sector associations as well, that call for certain things for their members. Or they can ask, what happened to this money that is supposed to be allocated to the private sector? What is happening with the allocation of contracts in this country, so that our members are unable to have access to it or to understand the process? So these organizations do play very important functions in democratic systems. We know trade unions as well can play these important functions, and even the small ones. If we look at this, what has happened recently with surrounding CXC, this is certainly civil society activity. So things that people call pressure groups. Sometimes these organizations may not live long. They may not exist for 10 years or 15 years, but they are important activities that emanate from civil society that call important institutions in our countries to account and ask them to explain why something has happened in the way that it has happened. And if they do not feel that they have an adequate answer, they can continue to push for this. And this is healthy in a country, to me.
Right. I just want to share a graph, a graph from your book where I think you describe in this chapter the political society as being the nexus of the state, the market or the economy, and again, these civil society type groups. Just I'll have you go ahead and explain or expand on this graph, because I read, I'm sure I understood what you meant, but for the benefit of the audience, what you've described political society as kind of the nexus of the state, the economy, and the civil society.
Yeah, so what we see is that in the real world, we can't always separate things neatly and put them in boxes. So we have some overlaps. So for instance, when I was talking about the private sector representative organizations, they may be in this overlap between the market and civil society. Because even though these organizations are representing businesses and the organizations are not trying to make money, their members are trying to make money, right? So there's a bit of an overlap in there. Sometimes we have organizations that have been created by governments or that are funded by governments. And then we can end up in a peculiar situation, which has been quite common in our history in the Caribbean, where you have organizations that end up getting mixed up in political parties, and the political parties are in government. I'm sure you can all think of one right now. People are making some arguments about the trade union. Right? So there are these intersections. So for me, I don't like to put political parties in as a civil society organization. The reason I don't like to, some people do think of them as that. But anytime that these organizations are successful at the polls and they take control of the state, they cease to act as civil society organizations. And I view them as within political society because their role and their function is to take control of the state and to form the government. So these types of entities that are mixed up in there are the ones that we would call political society. And sometimes they do overlap with other groups, especially in political systems that are like ours,
Right.
more so than, let's say, an American political system.
Right. So the entities like the Democratic Party, entities like the Republican Party will find themselves in that nexus of the state, the economy, and civil society in your conceptualization of them.
They can, especially if they do if they are involved in some kind of activities that seek to generate revenue. Sometimes there are political parties that go beyond generating revenue for their sustenance and seek to make profit. We also see that within civil society organizations. So there's this notion of civil society organizations becoming more entrepreneurial. So then they start to kind of shift into this area of the market. Right. So, you know, real life is a little bit more messy than in theory, but for me, always political parties are within political society. And then there are other entities that may fall in there too. So sometimes you may have organizations that start as one thing. They start as a pressure group, and then they end up running candidates in an election and merging with some other entity and then becoming part of a political party.
Anything from you, Ayo?
That's it.
Nothing from the audience on this?
Somebody just saying they're definitely going to get the book, so that's good news.
That's good.
I hope they enjoy it.
Yeah, I have a couple more questions on, I guess, on the same theme, because also in the book you advance the idea that, well, you point out that the political culture in the Caribbean tends towards authoritarianism, right? So you point this out in the book, or the dictatorship of the prime minister, the prime ministerial dictatorship, you point out in the book. So what role can these SCOs play in improving democracy or democratizing governance in the region, both at the regional level and at domestic levels? I've stolen again another chart from your very well-written book.
I'm happy, and thank you for the compliment. Well, civil society organizations so there are different things that we can see happening. As I said, they can function as pressure groups. So right. This may be working from the outside. So they may be calling governments to account. Sometimes it's things like having protests and marches. Sometimes it may just be, there may be things like letter writing campaigns and petitions and other kinds of activities that try to address some of these authoritarian tendencies. Even maybe what you're doing today, you're not a civil society organization, but you are from within civil society. So having a forum like this that discusses various topics, if it is listened to, and often these things are listened to, can have some effects on what happens in processes of governance. Now, what we also see is that governments may want to include organizations in efforts to become less authoritarian or to be perceived as such, which I think is often the case in the Caribbean. And so we can have things such as the social partnership being an example of this, where you have private sector representative organizations and unions. But right. Then there can be some concern about co-optation and the degree to which we have empowerment and democratization, or we have just another layer of an elite being placed along with the government. Right. We can have things like governments tell us about consultations, or we had a public consultation. This is a very low level of inclusion of civil society organizations and civil society, meaning all of us. Because often what we have in a consultation is that you have something that is preformed that you take to people, right? And then you ask for their opinion on it. And what happens with this opinion? Is there any guarantee that it will be taken into consideration? You may hear it, but you may think this is not feasible because you've come with something that is preformed. So right. This is still, more in the realm of, as I say here, the bureaucratic is not as democratic as other forms of participation. The more authoritarian is informing, and we see our governments doing that a lot and patting themselves on the back, right. As I did earlier, for informing people of what they're doing. So this is what we're doing with respect to COVID-19. These are all of the policies. These are the reasons why we're a nice democracy, because we have informed you, right? Just like how we can inform you that we're also going to enslave you next week.
Oh,
And we will provide you with all the details of how this is going to happen, but don't be alarmed. It's just an emergency.
slavery.
Informing is very authoritarian, even if we present it as something that is in the realm of democratization. It is useful, but it is not adequate.
Right.
Consulting is better, but then we can have, towards the bottom of this table, we can have the more democratic, where people are included at the beginning of decision-making processes. So we generally have an assumption that only people who are working within the public sector or who are specialists can give input on what needs to be done. But before you get to the stage where you have this lovely document written up, you can speak to people, speak to organizations, entities, regular people who have an interest or who may be concerned about something before you come with your document. So that is the more democratic, and organizations can also push for this in saying, when they see something that is preformed, this is nonsense and y'all should have come to us before, because this is why this doesn't work. This is why this should work. This is why the community does not need this. Organizations can push for this in many ways. Parent teachers associations, all kinds of groups.
So I guess what you're calling for in the book is the inclusion of CSOs in policy formation for the state, as opposed to having them be at the end, where this is more, let's say, a bureaucratic process, or some involvement but not really listened to. But you're calling for empowerment of these CSOs and having them be in the forefront of government policy formation at the beginning of the state of policy formation, as opposed to waiting until policy has been formed and we're just doing either informing, a box ticking, or some other type of political exercise.
Yeah. And nothing is perfect, right? Because there will still be mistakes that are made. But what we find, sometimes you get poor policy decisions because things were decided on without including people early on, and then there are a lot of changes that need to be made. You gotta change this, you gotta change this, you have to change this. But, and maybe it's because we assume that people don't understand what they need, what is useful for them, what would be benefit. We assume that people don't understand economics, they don't understand politics, they're not an engineer, they don't understand some technical area. But people do understand certain things about their lives and about what they require. And if we listen to them, we may be able to craft better policy.
I totally agree with you.
And this is something that is not just about the civil service. It certainly is about the politicians as well, because they provide some direction so these are the cabinet members, the ministers, they provide direction for the ministry. So every time they want them to go and do something, they should be asking them, did you all, before you brought this paper to me, go and talk to the people in this particular area or this association, this group? There are even very interesting and good pieces of policy, I think, that have suffered in Barbados from lack of inclusion of those who would be affected by it, including this one that we had recently to ban single-use plastics.
Right.
I really think that this was a very progressive piece of legislation, but I think that the implementation was totally blind and ignorant to the situation and the circumstances of those who were involved in that sector. And you end up, again, with a policy that you can end up with people having warehouses full of stock that they still need to dispose of.
Right.
So you have banned the importation of something. You've also made it impossible for people now to earn money off of the investment they've already made, and they have to take all of these single-use plastics and still throw them in the same landfill.
So
right?
And import replacements, right? So what are some of the mechanisms that government can put in place to ensure that we are down here at this empowering stage as opposed to anywhere else?
Well, so what I find very interesting is that we always talk about public sector reform. I've heard about public sector reform from the time I was a child. And this can be part of that. I have been recently again hearing about public sector reform, but it seems as if public sector reform today means digitization, which is very good. but it cannot just be about digitization unless the digitization is going to also help with these other things. And that would require that you have the majority of the population being able to access the technologies that would allow them to engage through the digital. So there is a lot of hope that by using electronic means of communication with government ministries, perhaps even with your member of parliament, that people can more easily become involved and engage at earlier stages. But this makes the assumption that people have access to all of the things that they would require to do this. My view is that one of the things that people require is information. And I think that our countries in the Caribbean, in Barbados, are very bad at giving people the information that they need. They give you the information that they would like you to have, but other pieces of information are very, very difficult to access. If you want to, as a researcher in the Caribbean, it is very hard to access important pieces of information about policy processes, about how contracts are issued, about all kinds of things, about business register, how many businesses are registered, how many are defunct. If you want to get crime statistics, for instance, you may have to write to ask for permission to access this kind of information. So to be meaningfully involved in some ways, people have to have access to the information that they need, and not just the information that people feel that you should have.
Right.
So we can do better on that while also guarding people's privacy and national security, things that need to be protected.
So freedom of access to information. So some legislation surrounding that.
Yes, freedom of information legislation exists in other parts of the region. And what this means is that you have a right to access information. So even if the particular government ministry or agency cannot give you the information now, they have to give it to you, and they have a time frame in which to give it to you. They cannot just tell you, we ain't got that in a PDF. We don't have that available. That's written down in a book. Let me ask my supervisor. This is a right. Right. And when you can access this information, then it can allow people, especially those who want to be politically engaged on particular issues, to be able to do so. Right now, if you want to ask certain questions about our educational system, it is very difficult to get information in Barbados about a lot of things that happen in the educational system. So this is not just high-minded stuff. If you want to find out what is happening in education, you need to know somebody in the ministry. Right. And that you could ask a question, they could pull down this information and give it to you and tell you this is how this happened and this changed, but we should not have to go through that. We should be able to access the information that is really public. Right.
But yeah, because it is public information if you think about it. It's our information.
Yeah.
So thanks for that. So again, the book is Civil Society Organizations, Governance, and the Caribbean Community by Dr. Kristina Hinds. Thank you, Dr. Hinds.
Thank you too for plugging it.
We'll keep doing so. Any questions from the audience, Ayo?
Just people agreeing on the statement about information availability. Ms. Anderson. Anderson is also asking a question here. Let me read it before I read it out loud. He said that today we learned that 2 former DLP members have moved over to the ruling party, strengthening their numbers and skill set. With a weakened major opposition by opposition party, would it be wrong to blame someone who may have concerns about democracy in Barbados? As now the third is clearly game to make any drastic changes. Who guards the guards?
Yeah, I guess in terms of procedural democracy, so if we're talking about the system of political representation, I certainly could have some concerns if we do not have a viable party that could form an opposition. So that is a concern. But I think some of what we were discussing shows us that democracy is not only alive in the parliament. So our activities also contribute to democracy. So when we have these sorts of discussions, when you have groups that raise questions for the government, that provide suggestions as well. This is also, sometimes it's not criticism for the sake of criticism, which some people think it is. There are people, private individuals, as well as groups that have suggestions that are viable suggestions. And when they put these forward to the government and they are listened to and they're acknowledged, these can all be healthy parts of our democratic systems. The danger is really the concentration, a heavy concentration of power and what that can allow. So there's this notion that you can have a benevolent dictator. This is possible, but we don't, the problem is that we don't know what kind of dictator you will get.
That's the problem.
So,
no.
yeah.
And
So,
you may have one for one generation, but there's no guarantee that his successor or her successor will be so benevolent.
and it's who they're being benevolent for as well. Because even in democracies, there are winners and losers. So even though we had an overwhelming majority of the country in Barbados vote for the Barbados Labour Party, there are still people that did not vote for them.
Right.
Even though in the US, you had more than 77 million people vote for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, you still had 71 million that voted for Trump and Pence. So this means that those who are in positions of leadership need to understand the groups that were not in favor of them.
Yeah.
And those people need to have an opportunity to have a voice, even if we do not agree with the voice. And the danger of not having an opposition is that you may not get a voice. But hopefully people on the outside will still provide that. And we do have avenues in the Senate as well that can possibly provide some of that voice. Our system concentrates power though. So even when there is an opposition inside of the House, you know, the Prime Minister and the cabinet still hold sway. It's only if you have something that's very close, where one person crossing the floor or two people crossing the floor can shift power, that you really have a serious check on the power of the government of the day.
Go on, sorry.
No, I was asking you if you had any other comments from the audience.
No, just agreement. But I want to ask Dr. Hinds about civil society involvement, and I mean, how much civil society involvement do we get today, and how much of it is actually effective in guiding policy right now, or in helping to guide policy right now? Do we have the avenues set up in such a way that they actually get the opportunity to make meaningful contributions?
Well, to the credit of the current government, in addition to the social partnership, they have also created a group that consults with Minister Colin Jordan, which is a non-governmental group. I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head. So there is that as an avenue, and it does include a wide variety, a wide cross-section of different types of civil society organizations. So that can be quite useful. But again, I've never been invited to any of these meetings. I don't know what the nature of and I'm not asking for an invitation, by the way, but I don't know what the nature of the meetings is, what the power dynamic is, the extent to which the concerns raised by the groups in there are heard and taken into consideration, or if it is just an act of signaling that we are doing better. Because there are many times when governments do things to send signals, including to send signals to those organizations that you are important and you are being heard. There are different roles for organizations. You can work from the inside, and there are groups that can work from the outside. And civil society organizations themselves need to be on their guard to make sure that they're not being co-opted or used. So when you are invited to a forum hosted by the government, you have to really ensure that you're being true to your membership or to the cause or the interest that you're representing, and that you are not being socialized into agreeing with, you know, the government with these iterated meetings. And there is a power dynamic, and it can be quite tempting, especially when you get to know certain individuals who hold power, to be very conciliatory, perhaps more so than you should be. So, you know, there are some drawbacks of being an insider, but there are some uses as well. So we heard Ms. Moore talking about being able to get more done from the inside. This is possible, but what is also possible is that the interests of those represented can get dampened down a bit because of this involvement with the government. So organizations do have to be very careful when they enter into these kinds of arrangements. And I do think that governments, including the previous DLP government, they did hold quite a few public consultations on many issues. This one also holds public consultations, but again, that's at the level of often informing people. Sometimes the consultations do get a little bit out of hand, which I quite enjoy. So, you know, people who are just supposed to be informed get a little aggravated about things, and they say exactly what they need to say, how they need to say it, and that is very useful as well. But one of the issues that our organizations face is that because they're voluntary, people have a lot of work to do that they're doing for free. They have issues of maintaining staffing, of even engaging properly, because a lot of people may not be willing to do things on a voluntary basis. People have their jobs that they need to attend to, and then they go to some meeting that the minister call or a consultation on a night when you're tired or something. So people involved in the voluntary sector, especially the organizations that are primarily voluntary, some of them do pay people. Caribbean Policy Development Center does. Barbados Chamber of Commerce and Industry is able to pay. So some are able to pay staff, but many are not. And this means that it really is an act of dedication to the cause, to the interest. And civil society organizations have their internal issues too. They're not perfect. In some of them, people are stealing the money, and there's mismanagement and all kinds of things. Not all of them, but as with any other organization, these are not, you know, magical solutions to anything, because they come with their own difficulties. But I do think, despite what people may believe, these organizations do a lot of work in our country, a lot of work in the region. And I had the pleasure of speaking to Mr. Kimar Safri the last time it was on Brass Tacks. And he was talking about the work that his organization does. This is very important work. And a lot of organizations do this very important work. There's a crisis center for people who have experienced domestic violence in Barbados. Our government does not have such a thing. Our government does not have a safe house or anything. The only one that exists in the country is provided by a civil society organization. So there are a lot of things that help the government that exist in this country and many countries that come from this voluntary sector, from civil society organizations that we don't appreciate and we do not provide credit for. Even sporting organizations, in helping to keep children off of the road and on the block or other places that we think are unproductive, they provide a very significant social function that is not often acknowledged. And another layer of community, even if people do not know their neighbors in the way that they once did, when people are involved in a club or group, that provides this layer of community, and people are asking, what become of Lisa? I haven't seen her for the longest time. Somebody will call and find out what has happened. So these are very important things in our society, so that, you know, sport is not just important for winning medals and the Olympics and that kind of thing. It plays other roles in our societies for youth, for non-communicable diseases that we're talking about today, for the elderly as well. We are concerned about how well our older populations are doing, and sports also provide options for them. You don't need to, when you reach a certain age, put down yourself, right? So there are a lot of organizations that exist in our country, across the region, across the world, that do really important work. And in doing this work, they save politicians and they save the public sector from having to do it, because somebody else is doing it for them for free. They're
delivering some of these social services that the government should really be providing.
Yeah, or filling up the gap of state failure, some may argue. The state may be failing in educating people. There are a lot of people who may not be able to read. And somebody makes a group, maybe it's a church group or something, where they teach people how to read in the community. They may be adults. This is a state failure. If you have a public education system and people cannot read or they're not numerate. And there are people that fill that gap where the state fails, and they often do not get much credit for it, and they don't ask for much credit for it either. They just do it because it is important. But then when the government is making policy on education, they should be talking to some of these people that are doing that work.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
But sometimes these people aren't visible either. Sometimes they're just doing it, for whatever reason. So, but what would you say? What would you say to people? Because there are so many small. Sometimes you don't consider them as, or people generally wouldn't consider them as civil society organizations because they're so small. Sometimes it's just 2 people or 3 people performing a certain role. What would you say to some of those people who are who are forming these organizations? What advice would you give to them in terms of growing and getting the funding and the research and so forth that they obviously need in order to be able to perform adequately and to grow?
Well, what I can say is that you don't always have to have an organization. So civil society is all of us. So all of us can play specific roles without forming an organization, without necessarily joining one. If people do want to form an organization, just like a political party should have some kind of base, organizations should have as well. So I get a little bit concerned when I hear about an entity that has registered as a nonprofit and is only one person. And this does happen in Barbados. I get very concerned.
Illegal.
Yeah, it happens, right? So who are you representing? Who's your membership base? Even if the issue is important, why are you calling yourself an organization? Why aren't you just an independent activist who cares about animals, if that's the issue? Why did you go and register this organization? So I think it is important to have people behind you, to have an actual organization. That's just my personal opinion. I also think that if you want to represent a cause, you need to understand it. And sometimes there are people that are champions of something, and the people they may be championing or the issue, they're not interested in how these people are doing it or what they're saying in doing so. So there needs to be this connection. These are sometimes the criticisms we have of civil society organizations, which is that they seek to represent some interest, but they're not representing it in the way that those people want to be represented.
Because they don't know enough to do it.
Yeah, and same thing that you get at political parties, right? They're representing you, but are they doing it how? In the way that you want to be represented.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Hinds. Unfortunately, this is another 2 hours that came to an end rather quickly.
Questions forever.
You don't realize that 2 hours passed, right? But this was indeed a great conversation, and we sure wish we could have you back sometime. To you, the viewers, thank you for coming in again. Thank you to those of you who would have commented and asked questions. Remember that if you have a special skill and you want to contribute to this program in some way to help us to make it better, drop us a note as we aim to make this the #1 show in these internet streets. So let us grow together, and I'll keep sharing the page. Invite your friends to join us right here next Sunday at 5 p.m. And to you, Terry, my co-host, thank you once again for being here and helping me to produce this show. And again, I leave you with the final word.
Well, thanks, Ayo. Thank you, Dr. Hinds, for being here, and thanks to our listeners. We hope to see you again next week as we bring more interesting discussions of this type. Right, so see you guys.